Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome Tyler Rasch to the Sejong Youth Forum in our web seminar. There is hardly any need for detailed introduction of Tyler, who is already widely known on many levels in Korea. So I would like to start by thanking him for his commitment to the topic of the environmental issues, and of course, for having accepted the invitation of Sejong City Office of Education to come and share his views. Please welcome Tyler Rasch.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's great to join you all here on Zoom today, no matter which time zone you're in. I'm sure you're all in very different places. I don't actually get very many opportunities to speak to people in English, especially about the environment. So it's a really great opportunity for me to talk to you about this topic today. But I'm pretty sure there are going to be some of you who do not know who I am. So I'd like to take a small amount of time to introduce myself. And then I will also tell you about where I'm from and what my perspective is on the environment, why I'm interested in it, and what I'm doing related to the environment. And then I'd like to get into a bit of a conversation with you about what I think we need to do or how we need to rethink about approaching this problem so that we can actually go about solving it. So I did prepare a few slides to share with you. So I'm going to request to share my screen just because, it's always nice to have some imagery as well if I'm going to show you where I'm from or tell you about myself. So if you can see this, correct? Yes? Okay, great. So the photo that you're looking at right now is actually a photo of where I'm from in the Northeast United States, and it's a state called Vermont. So Vermont is a very small place, and I grew up in a town that looks like this. So basically there are no houses, there are very few people, just a lot of nature. So that's where I'm from. Right now, I live in South Korea in Seoul, and I've been here since 2011. And I came here to do graduate research in international relations and politics. And then after finishing my graduate degree, I got involved in working in the media industry. And since then, I've been on multiple television shows, radio programs, educational programs, so on and so forth. And in 2016, I started working with the worldwide, the WWF, which is the Worldwide Fund for Nature. You've probably seen the Panda logo here or there. It's the world's largest nature conservation organization. So I've been helping promote that organization since 2016. So just to get back to where I'm from, again, a very small place called Vermont. And that's what you see in this photo here. I have some more photos for you. If I can just move on, right? So Vermont is in the Northeast United States, and it's right on the border with Canada. So we get a lot of snow. So this is what Vermont, you'll often see, trees that are covered with so much snow that the trees start to sag. They start to like hang down a little bit, right? And then when I grew up, we used to have snow days. So the school would have to plan for us to take a few days off because it would snow so much sometimes during the winter that you couldn't actually leave your house. So they had to cancel school because there was so much snow. So that's what it was like for me to live there. And no matter where I would go, if you want to go out and you want to play with your friends, right? You want to go I want to go hang out with my friend today after school, or I want to do something fun on the weekend. Let me go to my friend's house, right? Like everybody does that, right? But in Vermont, it's not exactly an easy thing to do because people in Vermont live so far away from each other and there are so few people. In order for you to get to your friend's house, you have to drive your car 20 minutes. You can't just walk down the street or get on the subway or take a bus. you have to get in the car and you have to drive 20 minutes to get to your closest friend's house. If you want to get to school, you have to take a bus for at least 45 minutes, if not an hour, right? So it takes a long time to get anywhere. If you want to go see a movie, you're going to be driving at least 35 minutes or so to the nearest town that actually has a movie theater. So there's really not a lot of people. And for me, growing up in a state like that, you know, when you're a kid and you want to go have fun and play with people, you have to go outside, but there's nobody there. So you just wind up hanging out in the forest, really. Just hanging out in the woods, you know, looking for animals. You know, you find some sort of, you know, animal dung and you're like, what kind of animal dung is this? Is this a bear? Is it a deer? You see animal tracks and you wonder where they came from or what they were. This one morning when I was a kid on the weekend during the winter, I woke up and my mom was like, go play outside. So I went and I was playing outside and I saw in the snow, because in the snow, you know, if an animal walks by, it pushes down all the snow under its feet and you can see all the tracks, right? So I see all these tracks in the snow and they're all going to the same place, right? And in that spot, all the snow was pushed down and it was red. It was red snow. And I was like, this is really weird. And I go over and you know what I see? I see the head of another animal, right? So what had happened was overnight in my backyard, what we call a bobcat, right? A bobcat is like a lynx or another kind of large predatory cat that lives in the mountains, right? Had caught a raccoon and eaten everything except for the head, right? So of course, if you live in Vermont, this happens on occasion. And that may, you know, be really weird to some people. But for us, when you find that, the reaction of my parents' reaction was, okay, let's take this and let's bring it to the local scientist, ask him what animal it was, ask him what happened, right? And then we took the head and we buried it in the ground so that the bacteria would digest the remaining parts of the animal. And then we had the head bleached and then we took the head to school and then the skull was in the school's science classroom. So in Vermont, it's just very normal to see nature in its very raw form because it's right in front of you all the time, you know, and going to school here, you have to learn about nature. You can't not learn about nature because it's all around you. So even when we have classes, you know, we would go outside for our classes. We wouldn't stay inside the classroom all the time. If we had a science class, obviously we would go out and we would test the pH of the soil or the chemicals in the soil, or we would go outside and test the air quality, or we would go and collect leaves in the forest and then have to write down what kinds of trees they were from, or, you know, do all sorts of field work. We would go outside into nature and actually learn from nature and do that kind of field work. And that wasn't only happening in science classes. In Vermont, it's very normal to also incorporate that into other types of education. So no matter which country you're from, you probably have a class about reading and writing, right? You have to read books, you have to write essays, you know, and you have to spell things the right way and grammar and all that stuff, right? You have to write a story about something that happened to you or what you think about X, Y, Z. So in Vermont, when we learn that, we read English language books, but the books that we choose to read tend to be related to nature, often written by authors that lived in the area that took inspiration from nature. So there's a very famous author named Thoreau who lived in the middle of the wilderness for a very, very long time and just wrote a book about that. And that's what we would read. And we wouldn't read this inside. We would go outside and we would read the book outside and have class outside. So it was also very common that teachers would say, okay, it's creative writing time. You have to write a story for us. You know, by the end of the day, it has to be, you know, 3 or 4 paragraphs. It's just go outside and write. And you go outside and you just write outside. So it was very normal to constantly be putting your body and your education in nature. So for me, it made so much sense growing up as a kid for that to feel close to who I am, you know, rather than thinking, oh, nature, that's something that's not related to me. Of course it's related to me. It's what I see every day. It's what I walk through to get home. It's what I play with when I'm bored. It's where I meet my friends. It's where I discover new things. It's where I learn. It was basically everything for me until I finished high school. So just to give you some more context about Vermont, this place that sounds weird in the middle of nature. For those of you who are familiar with Korean geography, it's about the size of Chungcheongdo. So, I mean, if we're looking at a map, a world map, and we're comparing it to a country, I mean, maybe it's kind of similar to the Netherlands or Belgium. It's very small. So, and the amount of people that live there, total in the entire state, are 640,000 people. 640,000. Now, to put that in perspective, I live in Seoul right now, and in the Seoul greater metropolitan area, right? So Seoul and Gyeonggi-do and everybody who comes in and out of here every day for work, that number of people can grow up to 20 million people at the most busy times of the day, right? So I don't live in a place that's anything like Vermont anymore. Vermont doesn't even have 1 million people, not even one. The smallest cities in Korea have at least 1 million people. You know, even, you know, Cheongju has more than 1 million people. Vermont doesn't even have 1 million people, right? So very, very small. And then in terms of geography, like I said, it's in the northeast of the United States. So in this picture, it's the blue part that you see in North America on the left. So it's up in the northeast. And then I took the picture of Vermont and it's also on the right side. So that's the shape of this state. And you can see the top of it is flat, right? So the flat part is right next to Canada. So here's the question. If I grew up in this place that's in the middle of nowhere and it's this big and has very few people, then what would have been the closest cities to where I lived? If Vermont only had 640,000 people, there wasn't a city in Vermont, right? Because there's not even 1 million people there. So you can't have a city. So where was the closest city to where I lived? Where do you think it was? Top number 1 closest city, we'll leave that later. So the third closest, where's the third closest? Third closest is New York. So if you go south from that blue mark on this map, directly south from the lower left-hand side, and then you get to the ocean, that's where New York City is, right? So from my house, that was maybe like a 4.5 or a 5-hour drive to get down there. The second closest city was Boston. Boston is from the southeast corner of our state, maybe 3 hours. And the closest city is actually Montreal, which is on the other side of the Canadian border, and it's just about an hour outside of Vermont. So the closest city to Vermont is actually a Canadian city. So Vermonters often go to Canada, and a lot of Canadians also come to Vermont. So sometimes it actually feels a little bit more like Canada than it does the United States. But so growing up there, I couldn't go to the city every day, right? My life was always in nature. My school was in nature, like I told you before. When I was in high school, I went to a boarding school because in Vermont, there aren't enough schools for you to go to one near your house. You have to live at school sometimes. So I had to live at school. for high school. So the school that I went to was in the middle of nowhere. And then when it would become the spring, we would have to wake up at night and then go out to the dirt road in the middle of the woods and help animals cross the road. That was part of our biology class, right? So in this picture, there's an animal, hopefully you can see it. It's camouflaged, right? On the left-hand side. It's a yellow spotted salamander. So in Vermont, yellow spotted salamanders lay their eggs in these little pools of water that collect in the mountains after the snow melts. So in the winter, there's lots of snow, it all melts. And in the spring, there's these pools. So they cross the roads to get to the pools to lay their eggs, and then they go back, right? So you have to help them at night, otherwise they might get hit by a car. So there's this period where we would go out and just help the salamanders cross the road. And our science teacher would teach us about how amphibians, right? How frogs, salamanders, and other amphibians go through metamorphosis, how they depend on vernal pools, what this kind of ecosystem is. So that's how we would learn about science. And this is a picture of my high school. This is my high school's front yard. So from where you are, if you're looking at this photo, there's a building right behind you, but in front of you is the field where we have cows, and then we also have solar panels. So at our school, it was really important for us to learn how to be self-sufficient. There were 200 kids in the school, and in order to graduate from high school, you had to take your normal classes, right? Just like every other student. And then you also had to work. But you don't get paid to work. Working is just so that we can stay alive, right? So the idea of working is you contributing to your community. So we had 200 kids and 36 cows, right? So our job was to wake up, go to the barn in the morning before breakfast and milk the cows, and then go to class. And then in the afternoon, there was another group of students that would come milk the cows again, because cows need to be milked twice a day around 5 or 6 a.m. and then again around 5 or 6 p.m. And if you don't milk a cow, then the cow will die because there's too much pressure in the cow and it needs to release the milk. So it's very important that the students go and milk the cows. And then, so we feed the cows, we milk the cows, we care for the cows, and then we take the milk and we drink the milk and we make cheese and we make butter and we eat it. So it was a very self-sufficient school. So in order to graduate from high school, every person in my school had to know how to milk a cow. So for us, nature was just always there. Even if it was farming, even if it was a very human-centric concept of nature, it was still a large part of our lives. So Vermont seems like a very eco-friendly, environmentally friendly place, right? And it is, but it wasn't always an environmentally friendly place. So nowadays, our state is about 75% forest, right? 3/4 of the state is forest. But a long time ago, they cut down all of the trees because they wanted to build buildings in New York and Boston, and they wanted to use the trees for energy and all of these things. So Vermont became a main source of timber. So what happened was this very forested state very quickly became empty. So you can see in the image on the left with 2012, that is our state capital, the capital of Vermont in 2012. And the hill behind the capital is covered in trees. But if you look at the 1870 photo, the hill behind the capital is bare. There's not one tree on that hill, right? So what happened was between the early 1800s and 1900, Vermont lost nearly 80% of its forest. So once completely, fully forested Vermont only had 20% left of its land with trees on it. And what happened was that because the forest got so destroyed, all of the animals that lived in the forest left, right? So what did they eat? They went to the farmers and they ate what the farmers were farming. So what happened then? Then the farmers got angry because they couldn't sell their crops and they didn't have enough food to eat. So they got poor and they started to starve. So in Vermont, the only wealthy people were the people who were selling the trees. And so what happened was there was a big, big protest in the state. All of the farmers and the normal people who don't own trees were protesting against the fact that these tree timber companies could just sell away everything and destroy the environment, because the result was that everybody else was suffering because the deer would come and eat their crops. The side of the mountain would start to slide, right? All of these mountain, like landslides and everything would start to happen in the state. And so they protested. And what happened was the state then decided to create a department to manage the forest. So that's when the Vermont State Forestry Department began. And the state actually started to regulate forestry and created a criminal court specifically to deal with environmental issues. And that all happened in the early 1900s. So down to 20% of the state, right? Only 20% was covered in trees. But starting in the early 1900s, they were trying to regulate it and make sure that the trees grow back. So by 1960, they were able to recover of over 60% of the forest. So what does this mean? This means this is Vermont right now, and the green parts you see are all forest. And the pink parts you see are all like fields, right? Fields with houses and things like that. So what happens and what this means is, even if we destroy the environment and we only have 20% of it left, if we can manage to create a system that regulates or manages our resources, we can recover those resources. It is possible, right? We can tell that it's possible because it's already happened hundreds of years ago, right? In Vermont. So we know it's doable. It's just a question of how do we actually do that now on a global scale? So this is what the environmental problem looks like to me. It looks like the same problem that Vermont went through a really long time ago. So then, you know, I went to college and I went to the University of Chicago and I was taking a class here. And for me, up until this point in my life, the environment was sort of, you know, important, right? It was important, but it wasn't, you know, everything to me. I wasn't gonna change my life for it or anything. You know, of course it's important to save the environment and to, you know, have a good relationship with nature. I'm from Vermont. What else would I think, right? But in reality, I need a job. I need to graduate from college. I need to eat, right? So I was busy studying. And then I took this class because at the University of Chicago, you have to take a class about, you have to take science classes, it's required. So I took a science class about geology. And in that geology class, you know, geology is the study of the earth, right? So how the earth changed and rock formed, and, you know, where we're standing is land right now, but maybe it used to be the bottom of the ocean. So how does the bottom of the ocean become land, and then tectonic shift? You know, that's geology, right? So my geology teacher, she says in the middle of class, you know, she's explaining all of the past eras of the earth before humans existed. And she's talking about 540 million years ago, right? And she's like, oh, but the ocean is now going back to 540 million years ago. And everybody was like, wait, what are you talking about? Wait, what? And she said, no, today's ocean is now going backwards towards 540 million years ago. And I was like, what are you, like what? And the explanation behind this is that there's too much carbon in the atmosphere and the ocean is turning acidic, right? So, and because it's acidic, calcium cannot become a shell. And because calcium cannot become a shell, crabs, any sort of shellfish, very important animals in the ocean are not able to reproduce or survive as well as they used to. And this keeps continuing over and over. And what's going to happen eventually is that the only things that will be left in the ocean is going to be jellyfish. Things that do not have shells, things that do not have spines, just jellyfish, right? And I'm like, what? You're crazy, right? It sounded crazy. You know, I'm just taking this class and she's like, what? Like, no, that's so scary. That's not possible, right? But then I take this other class about global warming. And again, this other teacher tells us the same thing. There's too much carbon in the atmosphere. The ocean is getting acidic. The ecology of the ocean is decomposing. And if we continue at this rate, eventually the average temperature of the Earth will raise a certain number of degrees. And if it raises up to 6 degrees, then we will lose 95% of all life on this planet. So what does that mean? That means that right now we're already 1 degree above warming, right? We're 1 degree of warming, and we're looking at about 1.5 within the next year or two. And they say that we need to stay under 2 degrees of warming. And if we hit 3 degrees, if we hit 3, then we can't control it anymore. Because what happens is, once we get 3 degrees of warming, forest fires continue, the tundra melts, and then all sorts of carbon that's already stored in the earth will then be released into the atmosphere. And it's just this consistent, constant cycle that feeds the global warming. And then eventually we get to 6 degrees faster than we thought, maybe even 8 degrees, right? So what's left after this 95%? 5% is left, right? But the first species that go extinct in any extinction crisis are the ones that are specialized and the ones that are complex, right? Species that only exist to do or live off of one specific thing, right? Like a bee has to get pollen from a flower, right? And there are some bees that have to get that pollen from only one specific kind of flower. So if that flower disappears, that bee disappears, right? So that specialized bee is going to be one of the first that will go extinct, right? Because it's dependent on only one thing. And then another thing that was the most complicated species, right? So large species like elephants or giraffes or people, right? We are very complicated species and we depend on a lot of resources. So we don't fit in the remaining 5%. The remaining 5% is insects and bacteria. So that's how bad it can get. And this is what my teacher is telling me, right? My teacher in school is saying me, it's gonna get really bad if we don't do anything. I'm like, what? This is crazy. This is crazy, but it's true. So the scarier part of it is that according to the 2020, it's the ecological report that came out of WWF, we've actually, if you look at the average number of species in species decline, right, in terms of the population of a species, right? If you take all of the species that have spines, right, vertebrates, if you take all these vertebrate populations and you look at the average decrease of that population, the average decrease is 68 point something %. So what does that mean? That means that we've lost already, we have lost 7 out of 10 vertebrate wild animals. 7 out of 10 already, right? So this conversation about losing 95%, even if it doesn't go that far, it doesn't have to go that far to be a problem, right? It's already a problem. And we've only experienced just over 1 degree of warming. So we already know this is a really serious crisis. So, and we can experience it in our daily lives. I'm sure you've experienced it as well. You know, if you live in the city of Seoul, or if you live anywhere in Korea, then at some point you're going to experience air pollution. And you know, this photo that you see right now is Seoul. It's a picture of Seoul, and you literally cannot see across the river. And I think that this photo is from around 2016. So, you know, after seeing this and experiencing this, it's just made me feel like I can't not do anything. I have to talk about this problem, right? If I'm on television and I'm on the radio, if I'm talking to people like you, right? I can't be like, oh, let's talk about money. Let's talk about, I don't know, food. Like, this is a topic that needs to be talked about, right? So I decided, you know, when I was living here in Seoul, that I needed to use my position to talk about this issue, because no matter how I think about it, my future is going to be decided by this problem, right? Your future is decided by this problem. Anybody who's going to be alive over the next 20 years is going to have to experience this problem. So we might as well talk about it. So I started talking about it on social media and here and there. And, you know, I got some backlash for it. Some people were like, oh, you know, why do you talk about this? It's a problem, you know, go back to your country or whatever, right? But at the end of the day, no matter what people say, the problem is bigger than people being uncomfortable, right? So I started talking about it on television, and thank goodness, more recently, more and more people have taken an interest in the topic. And so I published a book in 2020 called 두 번째 지구는 없다 in Korean. It's a book about the environment. So, and thank goodness lots of people have been reading the book, as well as many other books about the environment. And now I think a lot more people are interested in solving this problem. So in terms of the environmental problem, you already know, and you're very aware, I'm sure, of sort of the details of what it is, right? We have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? Which is caused by using carbon-based fossil fuels like oil, gas, shale gas, natural gas, coal, all of that, right? And just because we don't have a gas stove doesn't mean that we're not using gas, right? I have lights on in my house right now, but in South Korea, about 90% of the electricity comes from fossil fuels. So about 90% of the light in my house is based on carbon-based fossil fuels, right? So these are the problems that we have to fix. We have to decrease that percentage, right? So because of these fossil fuels, we've experienced a consistent raise in global average temperature. And because of that temperature, we've already experienced specific instances where we are actually harmed by this change, right? So when we think about the food that we eat, right? Not too long ago, about I think a year or a year and a half ago, here in South Korea, there weren't enough tomatoes. So maybe you like, I don't know, hamburgers or sandwiches or what have you, and you go to Subway or you go to Burger King or you go to McDonald's or you get, you know, tomatoes on whatever, you like ketchup. I don't know what it is, but say you like tomatoes and you go to the store and you're like, I want a sandwich with tomatoes. Well, in Korea, there was a period where you could not get tomatoes on your sandwich. So the stores like McDonald's or Burger King put up signs saying, oh, I'm really sorry, you know, customers, because we don't have any tomatoes because there aren't enough tomatoes. We'll give you extra lettuce, right? Which is kind of funny, right? It sounds funny because hey, imagine seeing a sign like that. It's kind of goofy, right? It's kind of silly, but it's not funny. And it's not funny because the amount of tomatoes that we have is dependent on whether or not we're able to grow them. And what happened was, because the monsoon season changed here, and the amount of rainfall, as well as the amount of moisture in the air, caused a blight, as well as a drought. So what happened is we didn't have enough tomatoes at all because of climate change. And that's why you got extra lettuce on your sandwich rather than tomatoes, right? So we are experiencing this problem. It's not like super serious in this case, but there are other cases where it's super serious, right? So the situation in Syria, where we had a bunch of Syrian refugees occur, I think many people have heard about this situation. And it's a very complex war scenario. But what happens is if you live inside of a country and there is a conflict in the country in a certain area, you don't usually leave your country immediately. Usually what you do is you go to another place. For example, if I live in Seoul and all of a sudden there's some sort of conflict and Seoul is dangerous, I'm not gonna jump on a plane and I don't know, fly somewhere, go to China or go to Japan or go to, I don't know where. I'm gonna go to a different part of Korea, right? I'm gonna go to Gyeonggi-do. I'm gonna go to Gangwon-do. I'm gonna go to Busan. That's normal, right? That's what happened in Syria. Many Syrians who were in conflict zones moved to other areas of Syria. But what happened was there was a massive drought in Syria and they were not able to produce their own wheat, right? So they couldn't make their own bread and stuff like that because they didn't have their own wheat. So they imported it. They were importing wheat from Russia, but Russia also had a drought. So what did Russia do? Russia had to have their own wheat. They couldn't export it. So what happened? Syrians did not have food. That was the result. So then a situation where you may have, I don't know, only a few refugees becomes a situation where you have tons and tons and tons of refugees because the people who left their town now need to leave their country, right? So this is what happened in Syria. It's just the massive size, the numbers that we've seen in refugees has increased because global food production can't keep up with climate change, right? So no, Syrian refugees were not caused by climate change, but the sheer number and size of that flow of refugees was highly influenced by climate change. And there are estimates now that if the world warms 1.5 degrees, then we will have about 400 400명이면, yeah, that's 400 million. Yeah, 400 million refugees in a year. But if we have a global increase of temperature of 2 degrees, right? 1.5 degrees is 400 million, but 2 degrees, which is only 0.5 degrees more, is 700 million, right? It's almost double. So it's going to cause a lot of damage if we can't start to control the problem. And we've already started to see that it's a problem. So, and another aspect of climate change is that the sea is warming, right? And I'm sure you've already heard that because the sea is warming, the poles are melting, right? And the sea level is rising. But there's another aspect to ocean warming. So if you go to, say you take a bath, right? You're gonna take a bath, you take some hot water and you fill the bathtub with hot water. Well, if the water is hot, then when you first touch it, the surface, right, the top of the water is really hot. But if you put your hand all the way down into the tub, only the surface is like stingy and then down is not so hot, right? Or if you have a glass of tea, right? The top of the water is the hottest part. It's the same with the ocean, right? The top of the ocean is warm, and the deeper you go, the colder it gets. That's how the ocean works, right? But now the ocean is warming, that top layer of warm water is thicker and thicker and thicker, right? So when we get a storm, right, like a hurricane or a typhoon, when we get a tropical storm, what happens is there's moisture in the air, and the moisture in the air changes the pressure of the air, right? Which makes the wind churn. So now that the wind churns, right, then the water starts to churn, right? And that's a storm. So then as the ocean water is churning around and around in circles, it also churns up and down. It's like if you go to a pool or you're swimming and you stick your hand in the water and you go like this, around and around and around, and it makes a whirlpool, right? It's spinning. But the water spins like this, right? But it's also spinning like this, vertically. So when a storm is going over the ocean, it causes the water that's below to rise to the surface. Normally, the cold water would come to the surface. If the cold water comes to the surface, it doesn't evaporate, right? So there's no more moisture in the air, and then there's no more air pressure problem, and so then the storm disappears. Normally, a storm, like a hurricane or a typhoon, disappears on its own. Really, just it's going and then it disappears because the water that's coming up is cold water. But now that doesn't happen. Now the water that's coming up is warm water because this layer has warmed, right? So it's gotten deeper. So now the water that's coming up is warm and it evaporates and it feeds the moisture in the air, and the pressure increases and the storm gets stronger and stronger. So this is why when we see hurricanes and typhoons nowadays, they're much, much stronger than when I was a kid or when your parents were a kid, right? So I moved to Korea in 2011. And in 2011, nobody really cared about hurricanes. But now people talk about hurricanes. They talk about them because Busan, Ulsan, cities in the southeast of Korea have been inundated and flooded and covered in torrential rain and damaged, and people have died because of these hurricanes. And this is because of global warming, and we're already experiencing it. So, and I said before, with the ocean warming, you know, the ice caps are melting in the northern and southern poles, right? But the rate at which they're melting is so fast that what we're expecting now is that by 2050, with the warming that we've already had, by 2050, the map that we know is not going to be the same world anymore. We're not going to be living on the same planet, right? Just the shape of the countries that we live in is going to be different, right? So this is the western side of Korea in 2050. The city of Kunsan, Kimje, Iksan, Poryongjuk, right? All of this area, the red part is going to be underwater, right? That's all underwater. And those are cities, right? And this is Shanghai, right? So Shanghai will be underwater in 2050. And this is Bangkok, again, all underwater. So this is also a picture of Incheon, right? It's an area called Songdo in South Korea, and it's received a lot of investment for real estate development and everything. This city will also be underwater. And so will both of Korea's major international airports in Incheon and in Kimhae. And this is true for a lot of other countries as well. For the United States, the entire lower half of the state of Florida will be gone. The majority of the state of Louisiana, New Orleans, will be gone. New York will also be partially underwater, so will Boston, right? And this is what we expect to be seeing around 2050. So this is if we can keep average global warming temperature to 2 degrees or under, right? In order to do that, we really have to focus on changing the way that we live and our economy works. So one thing that we need to be careful about is misinterpreting how serious this situation is, right? It's like when we talk about the environment, we hear all sorts of data, right? I just showed you maps, like, oh, we just talked about these maps, 2050 or 2 degrees of warming, or, you know, there's numbers, maps, data, right? This is all really recent information, updated stuff from high-tech satellites and imagery and big data and all of this complicated high-tech stuff, right? But the fact is, every time we update that information, we realize that the situation is worse than it used to be, right? So the maps that I showed you, people are now saying that we should expect more around 3 times the amount of flooding than what was shown in the maps, because our technology needs to be updated in order to properly reflect what we're actually experiencing. So what does this mean? This means that when we talk about data about how severe global warming is right now, then we need to keep in mind that we're not able to know everything, and it could be worse than what we know, right? There's a chance that it could be worse. So we need to be careful and remember that. Not all of these numbers are accurate, but that does not mean that the situation is less dire. It does not mean that we're safer. It means that we may be less safe, right? So another thing to remember is that sometimes when people talk about the environment, particularly our parents or older people, politicians, they will talk about the environment as if we need to save the environment for the next generation, right? They'll always say the next generation or future generations, right? Here's the thing. Those politicians and those teachers, those people are our parents and our grandparents. So to them, future generations are you and me. That's who they're talking about, right? The pictures I showed you before, that's 2050. I'm not even retired in 2050. I can't retire then. I'm still too young, right? So where will you be? You'll still be working, right? Future generations are you and me. When you hear somebody talking about we have to save the environment for future generations, remember, they're talking about the perspective of an old person, not us, right? It's our generation, it's your generation, we're experiencing this, right? And another thing that we often forget about is that this is not a problem that we can solve by ourselves, right? No matter how hard we work by ourselves, it's too big. So we have to actually join together to actually create change together. So how does that work? If you take an American, right? I'm from America, right? So Americans produce on a per capita basis, right? Per person, the most carbon dioxide on the planet per person. But even if you tell one person to perfectly change and not produce anything, not to make any carbon dioxide, not to destroy the environment at all, that one person can only reduce American pollution by 0.0000000003%, right? It's practically nothing. So one person by themselves cannot solve this problem. It's impossible. But if you take this number, 0.0000000003, and you multiply it by the number of people who live in America, then you pretty much get 100%. So if you get everybody to participate, we can solve the problem. That's what it means. But if we do it by ourselves, we will not get there. So that means we need to be paying attention to how other people, how companies, how governments, how schools, how organizations are trying to solve this problem, not just ourselves. And we need to be aware if somebody else is telling us, hey, you, this is your problem, you need to solve it, that is not accurate, right? So for example, something that is not accurate is what BP, which is British Petroleum, it's an energy company from the United Kingdom. They wanted to sort of repackage their image to look environmentally friendly. So they put up this tweet a few years back, and they said that they had this calculator on their website where you could put in some information about yourself and calculate how much carbon you emit in the atmosphere. And then you can say, oh, I'm going to save this much carbon, and you can promise to reduce your carbon footprint. And that's this calculator that they had. So on their Twitter, they said, hey, the first step to reducing your emissions, is to know where you stand, find out your carbon footprint with our new calculator, and share your pledge today. What is this? This is a fossil fuel company telling average people, hey, you should solve this problem. What are you going to do about it? That's weird. That is really weird, right? So the response to this from many, many, many people was very negative. For example, BP was well known for having spilled oil into the ocean. So many people said, as a joke, ha ha ha, I pledge not to spill oil into the ocean like you do. So basically, they criticized BP because they're being hypocritical, right? They're not doing what they say. They're telling other people to solve the problem. They're giving you the burden of solving the problem without actually doing something about it themselves. So sometimes, here and there, you may hear in your daily life, people say, oh, make sure you do this, right? And yes, it's good for you to do something, but that doesn't mean that that other person can get away with not making an effort, right?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Tyler. Thank you so much. I hate to cut you off, but we are running low on time, and I want to make sure our student panelists can get to you at some point.
Sure.
So is it all right to continue on to our question and answer situation?
Sure. Yeah, do it whatever you need.
Thank you so much. So thank you for your speech, and I'm sure that there was so much more to hear from you. And buy the book, of course. Anyway, hello everyone. My name is Sophie Ranis. I am a teacher in Sejong City, Korea, and I'm really happy to be here. We just heard from Tyler Rasch, and he's a very important public figure in Korea. As you know, he mentioned a lot of things that he's done, and it's really amazing. You can see him pretty much everywhere, from commercials to the subway to YouTube, textbooks, TV. He's everywhere. You can't escape him. And we don't want to escape you. So I did want to get to our questions. And there are hundreds of questions from all around the world, and that's why I had to cut you off. And so I want to say thank you, everyone, for your curiosity and your interest in this huge, huge, huge problem that's affecting us now. And of course, the clock is ticking, and there's time for just a few questions. And so I'll start. Speaking of clocks, on television, you, Tyler, introduced the environmental doomsday clock, and doomsday meaning the end of the world. And so if it was possible, could you explain about that really quickly?
Sure. So there's this, people try to find many different ways to quantify or explain how serious the environmental problem is, right? Because it's very complicated, it's very big, it's hard to sort of say, oh, this is a grade A problem, a grade B problem, a grade C problem. It's not really that easy, right? So they came up with this concept of having a clock, right? Like the clock you see on the wall. And if it becomes a certain time, then that means that we only have the remaining amount of time before it's too late, right? So for example, if it turns midnight, then it's the end. We can't do anything, right? But if it's 9 p.m., we still have some time left, right? But if it's 10 p.m., it's kind of scary. If it's 11 p.m., it's even scarier, right? So sometimes people use this doomsday clock as a way of measuring how dangerous the situation is, right? So I'm not sure exactly where the doomsday clock is right now in terms of time, but it's probably kind of on the late side.
Yeah, probably not great. So in that case, I was wondering, just like you were talking about before with BP, which is this huge major oil company,
Yep.
kind of spinning the blame and saying individuals can make all the difference. A lot of students, so many students ask, I want to make a change. I want to change I want to reverse the clock. I want to give more time to the universe, to the planet. And what can I do to help? And I think it's really good to readjust expectations but also give some actionable advice.
Right.
What can we do?
Right. So step one is talk about the problem. You have to talk about the problem. If you're in school and you see that the school is wasting energy, or you see that the school is wasting paper or something like that, then you need to ask questions about that. Say, hey, teacher, or hey, people who work at the school, what can we do to turn the lights off? What can we do to use less paper? Don't try to solve the problem on your own. Ask other people about the problem, engage them about it, and talk to other people about the environmental problem. Because if we don't do that, then other people can just sort of pretend that it's not there, right? So step one is to talk about it. It's to bring it up in the classroom, bring it up with your parents, bring it up with your teachers, talk about the problem, right? Step two is later on, maybe some of you are already old enough, but later on when you can vote, if you have the right to vote, then make sure that you're checking to see if the person who you're voting for has some sort of understanding of the environmental problem, right? And try to vote for those people because they can help, right? And then the third solution is, if you're shopping and you're gonna buy something new, you're gonna buy something to eat, you're gonna buy a snack, right? Usually look at the price, right? Or what snack is it? But if you look at the back side of the snack or on the side of it, you might see a certification. There might be a symbol there that says that the snack was made in a way that hurts the environment less, right? For example, in South Korea, and probably most of your countries, you can go and buy soy milk or something like that in a little packet, like a juice box. Some of those juice box packets have a symbol on the side that looks like a tree and says FSC on it. Those were produced in a way that does not destroy the forest. So try to buy those juice boxes. If you go shopping with your parents and you're in the store and you're like, oh, what soy milk do we buy? Or, oh, what juice do we buy? Instead of just buying what's in front of you or saying, I like this brand. Instead, when you take it off the shelf, turn it around, look at it. Is there something on it that says, this was produced more sustainably? That's all you have to do. So talk to the people around you, right, about the problem. When you have the ability to vote, think about the environment and vote. And then when you have the chance to make a purchase, try to buy something that is more environmentally friendly.
It really sounds like the environment touches on every single part of life, from school to politics to shopping, even the fun stuff like games and electricity. And now I cannot steal you any longer. It's time for the student panelists. So we have our questions from our student panelists. We have students from Korea, India, Malaysia, and Turkey here today. And So what I'd like is for us to start with our high school students. Sorry, guys. And so it'd be great if you could introduce yourself, your name and your country, and then ask your question to Tyler Rasch. So let's have maybe Diane. Could you start first? Sorry.
It's okay. Hi, I'm Diane. I'm from Sejong High School. And my first question is that you said before that 90% of Korea's energy is fossil fuels. So what type of energy do you think is the most reliable or sustainable source for our generation?
Great. Thank you for your question. So the question is, what type of energy other than fossil fuels would be a good option, right? So there's a lot of debate around this topic, but I think universally, the most quickly, the energy that's being the most quickly adopted right now as an alternative to fossil fuels is renewable energy, right? So whether that's ocean-based wind farming or hydro dams or something like that. Those options are being very, very quickly adopted. And I think that that is a very, very good option. Some people do think that nuclear energy is another way to go. And I mean, if that's your opinion, I totally respect that. For me, as long as it's not fossil fuel.
Fantastic question. I think we can, maybe we'll give you another chance if there's more time, but for now, let's move on over to Rachel. Rachel, please ask your most important question. If we have her, but I don't see her. Oh no. I guess she's not here. Okay, well, we'll move on, I guess. So Nisa, yes, I think Nisa, you can do it. On to you.
Okay. Well, I'm Nisa Jabotaşkar and I'm from Turkey. My question will be about what we talked about at the end of the speech. We were talking about the oil company, and through my research for this as well, I learned that the majority of the harm that is done to the environment comes from companies and the ultra-rich people. So what can we do to keep them responsible for this?
That's a great question, and a very well-informed, educated question. So I think really it comes down to how we spend our money, whose products we buy, and whose we don't. So, I mean, for every country, it's very different, but I'm sure in Turkey as well, you have the same situation, but in South Korea or in the United States, if someone does something that the citizens don't like, right? If a company does something and it's a really bad thing, they abused someone or they did something bad, then the citizens don't want to buy that company's product. So it often happens that they literally boycott the company. Here in South Korea, you've had multiple instances of that. I mean, recently there was a boycott of Japanese products. In India, as far as I know, there was a boycott of Chinese products. In South Korea a few years ago, there was a boycott of a Korean company, a dairy company, a milk producing company that sort of abused people that had disabilities. And when this became known, consumers said, I'm not buying your product. And all of a sudden the companies had to change. So boycotts, I think, are very effective. It's just that we haven't really applied boycotts to the environmental problem. You see it happening in the United States or in other places around the world with cotton, for example, with Chinese cotton produced by Uyghur labor in Xinjiang, right? You've seen this happen before. But I mean, not many people have really applied it on a wide scale to the environmental problem. So I think one of the number one ways we can do it is by changing whose products we buy and changing what companies we invest in. So if you don't buy a lot of products, then the other good option is to convince other people to invest their money somewhere else. So for a good example of this was when I was in college, I was at the University of Chicago in 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, like that time frame. And back then there was a very, very serious human rights issue in Darfur. But many companies and many universities were invested in companies that were involved in that area. And when this became known, students started to protest their schools, saying, we don't want our school invested in companies that engage in human rights abuse. So they protested the university to divest from Darfur, right? So I think that is something that students can do, and that university students can do, that consumers can do, is if we find out that there is a company that is now investing more money into fossil fuels companies, they're investing more money into unsustainable things, then we should boycott their products and we should tell people to divest from those companies. We should not be putting our money into those companies, because in the end of the day, rich people get their money from people like us. Right? So it's a question of whether or not we give it to them, right? Give your money to a company that is more, sustainable and more aware. So that's why I mentioned certifications. There are many certifications out there. It is a little complicated, but FSC is a very good certification if you're looking for something to learn about. So it's the Forest Stewardship Council. There's also a Marine Stewardship Council for the management of fisheries, right? So ocean-based resources. And then there's, I don't know if you've heard of B corporations, but B Corporation is another really good certification. And most of these companies have to implement some sort of more environmentally friendly practice. So try to buy those companies' products instead of others, and divest from the companies that are putting more money into fossil fuels.
Put your money where your mouth is. Be careful with your purchases.
Yeah.
Rachel, you made it. We're so happy. Rachel, it's your turn.
Thank you. I disconnected a while back then. So I have a question. Besides things that you mentioned, what else would you enforce or influence people to do to help the environment?
Other than what I've mentioned so far, for me, it's like I think about this when I work, right? When I do my job, what can I do in my job to change the way that other people act, right? So I think you have to think about it based on what it is that you do. As a student, there are things that you can do better than I can, right? There are people that you can change better than I can. But as I run a company, right? I run a small consulting company. And when I work with media companies, I write contracts. So when I write those contracts, I can put something in the contract that says, we are only going to use electronic contracts. We're only going to be paperless. We're not going to use paper, right? I can put these things into our agreement and force the other person to try more, even if they didn't really want to in the first place. I can convince them to try, right? So that's something I can do as a business person, is to put environmentally aware business practices into my contracts, right? So that's very, very specific. But the reason why I'm talking about it is because you really have to imagine, what can you do in your situation? If you're an artist, what can you do with your art that convinces more people to think about the environmental problem. If you're an investor, what can you do with your client's money that will help save the environment? You know, you have to think about what position you're in and try to come up with a creative solution, because like I said before during my talk, one person doing something on their own is not enough. So we have to come up with creative ways to get other people to act with us. And those creative ways may not be directly related to the environment itself.
That was fantastic. Really quick, if you have any ideas about what students could do specifically, because we have so many students, over 120 students with us today, what would you suggest?
I would suggest that next time if you go to your school, physically go to your school, take some time to walk around your building. Look to see where the trash is going. Look to see how your lights turn on and off. Look to see, you know, what kind of toilets or sinks you have, or, you know, just what's on the walls, you know, and just ask yourself, what can we change that would make it a little bit more efficient? Do we not have a recycling bin in our classroom? Or is the light switch in a weird spot so we constantly forget to turn it off? Or, you know, these kind of things, they sound small, but when you start to look for them, then you get better at solving the problem. And you also find something that you can tell other people about. You can say, hey, let's do a campaign at school to change the light bulbs so that the light bulbs are more energy efficient. Let's do a campaign at school to do some sort of paperless homework assignment. Let's do a campaign. Like, you can come up with all sorts of different things that you can do in your school physically or with your curriculum, right? That can be a little bit more environmentally friendly. And when you do this, it's not that you're saving the environment when you do that in that moment. It's that by doing that together, you're going to inspire so many people around you, so many other students. You're going to inspire your teachers, your school administrators. You're going to inspire your friends' parents, and they're going to start to think about it. And that is how we solve this problem. So when you go to school, try to think about what it is that you can change in your space. What can you change in, you know, do your seats need to be in a different spot? Does the printer need to be in a different spot? Does your light need to be a different light? You know, should you be having class outside instead? Have class outside. You don't need to turn the lights on. I mean, there's got to be something that you can do, and anything creative is good. And I highly suggest that you come up with an idea and you write it down and you share it with your teacher, you share it with your schoolmate, you share it with your parents, and you say, hey, can we try this? And see what they do.
Wonderful. That is really inspiring. And I hope you're ready. Sejong, it is your turn.
I'm Sejong from Korea. And first of all, thank you for giving me this exciting opportunity to participate in this webinar. It was such an inspirational lecture. So here's my question. Quite a few people are aware of the seriousness of environmental problems, but so far there has been no significant movement across the country and internationally. How can we get more people to take action for our planet?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we need to be thinking about, right? So we need to talk about it more. Again, I'm going to say that over and over again. As a person who's on TV and radio, you know, I was not originally known for talking about the environment, but I talk about it as much as I can. And I think that is step one. So in order for an action to happen, people need to think about what action they're going to take. They need to plan it, and then they need to make sure that other people are okay with it, and then they can execute it. So taking action is not an easy thing to do, right? So talking about it first is the quickest way that we can actually get some sort of momentum and convince people who are not doing something about it to actually move forward, right? So, I mean, I think protest is a wonderful way of going about it. And I think there's many other ways you can protest. You know, if you're not in the ability, if you're not able to do, you know, the Friday, you know, school strike for climate with, you know, Greta Thunberg, then I'm sure you can find other ways to protest as well. If you have social media, do you follow, you know, environmentally related accounts? Or do your friends follow those accounts? If you don't, then you should. If they don't, then you should suggest that they do, right? So that is a good beginning, because often in our daily lives, you know, we're sitting there, we're looking at Instagram, we're looking at some sort of game or whatever it is because it's fun, right? We're watching YouTube videos, right? But we're not subscribed to any environmentally related anything. Well, that's what you need to change, step one, so that you're thinking about it every day and you can talk about it every day and you can convince other people to do the same. So, I mean, I also become really, you know, it gets me down sometimes to think about the fact that some people don't take action about this problem. When I published my book, I put as a requirement in the contract that sustainable, like certified FSC paper and soy-based ink be used for my book. And that was the first time that somebody did that at a major publishing house in South Korea. The first time. And that's shocking to me, you know? I thought that other people would take that action, but the fact is that people hadn't been talking about it. So of course they didn't do it, right? You got to talk about it. And then eventually somebody's going to be like, oh, hey, should we try this? You know, I had been talking about FSC paper and soy-based ink for months before I was able to actually find someone who was willing to produce a book like that. So we need to talk about it. We need to follow those social media accounts about the environment. We need to watch documentaries and get our friends to watch them. We need to have those conversations. You're having dinner with your parents, talk about the environment. They're not going to want to talk about it. Who cares? Talk about it. You know, that's what's going to get people to change. That's what's going to get people who are not taking action to actually do it.
Sounds like using TikTok for good.
Yeah, basically.
And then we have Heats. Is that right?
Yeah, no problem. So hello, Tyler, sir, and everyone here. This is Heath from India. So first things first, your talk was quite productive. I found it useful. And jumping to the question, my question to you would be, for a country like India, where population is quite high and demand for infrastructure is quite high, trees are being cut down every day so that timber is available. What would you suggest to such countries?
I think that's a really, really tough question. So the question of economic development, growth, and environmental conservation, it's really hard for a lot of people to put those in the same box and understand it, right? Most people think that you cannot develop an economy without destroying the environment. There's a lot of people who think that way. I personally do not think that way. I think there are other types of economic development projects that create money that can be designed to fit with conservation. And a good example of this actually is WWF. So WWF was founded in the 1960s, and what they do is they protect wild animals, right? And they do it by taking a large piece of land and saying, there are endangered species here, we have to protect this land. And then they get approval from a government, money from different companies, and they create a staff that manages that land. And for a long time, that's all they were doing. But then they realized that they weren't really able to protect as much as they could, because there were some people who didn't want to protect that land. They wanted to use it for other things, right? So in China, there are large panda preservation reserves in China, in Sichuan province and in Shanxi province. And what WWF did was they convinced the local government, right? So in the local area, what was happening is pandas, they eat bamboo, right? But they don't eat big bamboo. They eat baby bamboo, only small bamboo, right? Because the big ones are really hard, they can't chew it. They eat the small shoots, right? So they're running around the mountains and they're eating these bamboo shoots. But the people who lived in the area, they needed to farm. So they cut down tons of trees. Instead of the trees, they planted like Chinese herbs, and they would sell the herbs. And with the cut down trees, they would sell the timber, and they would keep some of the logs, hollow them out, and then use those hollow logs for bee farming. So what was happening is they kept chopping down all of this stuff, right? And then the panda numbers dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped. So what did they do? So WWF went to the local government, to these people, and they designed together a new economic plan for that region. So what they did was, instead of cutting down the trees to farm the Chinese herbs and then use the logs for the bees, if you take a log and you empty it out for a bee, the bees have to build a hive in the log, right? And it takes them a really long time to do that. They build this hive in the log, and then they make the honey. And to get the honey out, you literally have to destroy the hive, right? So local farmers who had been doing this were only able to sell their honey like once a year. And that's why they had to keep cutting down trees, because they couldn't earn the money from the honey, right? So WWF got a bunch of beehives, right? The kind that have the slots. And they got those beehives donated to the area. They protected the local region. And then the government created a special, in Korean, you'd say 특산품. It's like a regional specialty product, right? And it was the region's like tourism honey, and it was called Panda honey, right? And so they rebranded that region as an ecotourism region where people would go to maybe see the forest and then go to a museum, learn about pandas, buy some panda honey, eat some good food. And that local region wound up actually earning a lot of money. And these people didn't have to cut down trees anymore, right? So there are ways that we can design businesses that fit with protecting the environment. So how can India do that? I have no idea. That's your job. Yeah, I'm sure you'll figure out a good way to do that. But yeah, there are a lot of cases out there about local development in more sustainable ways. So, I mean, I'm sure there are other ways that India can find out how to do that, or Indian businesses. It would probably require a lot of collaboration, right? Like I said before, you can't do this by yourself. All of these solutions, they have to involve other countries, other businesses, nonprofits, research institutions, blah, blah, blah. You know, it gets very complicated, but those options are available, and there are ways to protect the environment and grow your economy as well.
That was really nice. So our last student speaker is Hyojun. Ready?
Yes. I'm Hyojun from Korea. So my question is, so after reading this book, I came with ideas that everyone could do it. So I tried to persuade my friends, families, and others to like save the earth. But after I talked to them and a day later, they did nothing.
Yeah.
So about persuading them, you gave the advice of talking and talking over. But will that be enough? Like, should we change the way to persuade?
That's a good question. I don't know. But I think you should keep trying. And I think when you try to change how someone views something, it's really hard to get someone to change their opinion if you can't help them experience something new, right? If they can't experience the solution, even just a tiny bit, then it's hard for them to change their mind. For example, say you really like chocolate, but your family really hates chocolate, but you really want them to like chocolate. So you're like, oh, come on, guys, chocolate is really great. It's this good for you. You know, it costs this amount of money. You can buy this much chocolate for what you pay to buy kimchi. Why don't you just buy chocolate? We could have chocolate every day. It would be great. They'll listen to you, but they might not change their mind. How are they going to change their mind is if you talk to them like this, and then you say, here, try this. It's not a lot of chocolate. It's like 5%. It's like this much chocolate. It's a chocolate flavored milk. Try it, right? And if they like it, then it'll be easier to convince them to buy more chocolate, right? So when we're talking about the environmental problem, it's the same. They have to experience a win. They have to experience a small win, something tiny that they did right, that felt good, so that next time you talk about it, they're like, yeah, that did feel good. Yeah, I did like that. That did work. Maybe we should do more, right? So if you're talking about this, like, and then you go to 편의점, right? You go to the convenience store with your sibling or a parent, right? And you're like, hey, do you want some tuyu? Let's look at the tuyu together. And then you get 같이 보여주고, right? And you're like looking at it together and you're like, hey, look, you see this? Let's buy this one. It's more environmentally friendly. And then you buy it together, right? You do that together. You do that once. Then next time you talk about it, you can be like, hey, remember that time we bought that? Hey, remember that time we did this? And then that person can then actually relate to having made an effort. They made an effort, something good happened. And then every time you talk about it, they'll remember that. So it's easier to convince them more and more and more to do more that's helpful for you, right? So for example, the book that I wrote, that you read, that book was produced with environmentally friendly paper and ink, right? So if you tell your friend, oh, hey, read this book, and maybe they like it, maybe they don't, maybe they agree, maybe they don't, because they will at least at the end of reading the book, you can say, well, hey, you read a book and that book is more environmentally friendly than another one. So at least you did something, and you can already convince them that they've done something, right? So you can make them experience a win, make them do something really tiny, right? Switch your toilet paper, right? Switch your toilet paper to the brown one. Switch your kitchen towel to the brown one, non-bleached, right? I forget the name of the brand that I use, but there's a Korean brand that doesn't bleach their toilet paper or paper towels, right? Just switch that. It's pretty much the same price, right? You change that, you're already doing something. You say, hey, look, we're already doing well, let's do more. They'll believe you, they'll start to move along. So have them experience that tiny win.
So speaking of wins, we're right about to wrap up, 2 minutes left, but I think it's always really great to end with like a little bit of sunshine, like a little bit of hope, and we all need that win. It's been a really rough hour and a half of sadness. So could you give us a bit of sunshine for like a minute?
Yeah. So I think, you know, when we talk about the environment, it's really scary and really depressing because it's a really serious problem. And that's not something that, you know, I can't make it, you know, happy and shiny and wonderful. But what I can do is I can tell you that right now, the number of people who are aware of the problem has drastically increased compared to what it used to be even just 2 or 3 years ago. And the number of people who are asking and saying, hey, I want to do something, it's shocking to me, literally. I used to talk about this problem like, you know, since 2016, right? I was talking about this problem and people would tell me, Tyler, go home. Shut up and go home. Like, don't talk about this. Go to your home, go back to your country. We don't want to talk about it. They were not interested. But now so many people are interested. So I think we need to realize that, yes, it's difficult, but there is something that comes from working together and talking about it. and having a conversation, that really does move us forward, and that builds momentum, and that gives us an opportunity to be able to actually solve problems and have a better life. So I think the fact that even we are having this conversation is pretty incredible. This is the first lecture that or talk that I've had here on Zoom in English about the environmental problem. And that's, that's incredible for me to be able to talk to you guys about that. So I hope that more and more in your lives, in your daily lives, you'll talk about this with more people around you. And some of them will be like, oh, but we can't solve it. Oh, but we can't do anything. They'll be negative. But don't give in to that. Find those tiny wins. Keep having the conversation, because more and more people are interested and everybody wants to solve the problem. So keep your chin up and we'll all figure it out together.
We're on this together. All right, thank you so much once again, Tyler Rasch, and our student panelists and everyone watching at home. It was fantastic to hear you all speak and hear all your inspiring conversations. And thank you all so much for being a part of this webinar. And now it's time to make a difference. Good luck, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Good job. Hi, Annette. Oh, it's not exiting. Bye.
Hello.
Bye, Annette.
Bye, Annette.
I'm trying to answer the question.
Today.
I'm responding to students' open questions. How are you? Ooh, one more day. Thank you for hanging in there.
That's why I found the number. I'm okay. Yeah, you're still alive.
Good. All right. Take care.
나갔어.
Bye.
Bye bye. See you tomorrow if you can. Bye bye.